February. You know what that means. 2025 position previews. Welcome into Fantasy Baseball today on Monday, February 3rd. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Scott White and Chris Towers. Today on the show, it is our 2025 catcher preview. And here's how the position previews are going to work. A little strategy overview up top. We'll deep dive the top 12 in ADP. We'll reveal our sleepers, breakouts, busts, and favorite to draft at each position. Then dive back into the rest of the ADP at the position. Of course, if you're watching live, you know that this is our take two, but we are here and we are ready to talk about catchers. Last year, I started off this very podcast talking about how catcher felt deeper than usual. No surprise, but it wasn't.
Stinky opinion, Frank.
Yeah.
First time around, I made a fart noise, but I didn't do it well, so I'm not going to try again. Chris, do you want to go ahead? Yes, that's how I feel about catcher now.
Yeah, like last year, I was working on my position preview, and I was like, last year I said we were witnessing a changing of the guard at the catcher position. And then I went through, like, it was technically true. We had a new number one catcher. It just, one, wasn't the guy we thought it was going to be. And two, all the guys that I was like, look at all these young names. And it was like Logan O'Hoppe and Shea Langeliers were good, and everybody else stunk. Remember Gabriel Moreno was the hot breakout pick this time last year?
O'Hoppe and who else you said were good?
Shea Langeliers.
Yeah, but O'Hoppe wasn't even that good.
Yeah, he was
terrible in the second half.
Gosh, Henry Davis is a sleeper.
Yeah. There's my fart noise.
I drafted Bo Naylor in every league. It wasn't.
Yeah. Mitch Garver.
This is what we do at tight end and catcher in fantasy football and baseball, respectively. Every year, we're like, yeah, this is the year. This is the year. And it's not. It's not gonna be
a lot of good
year.
Catchers have emerged in recent years, just not necessarily the ones we thought.
Yeah. And I keep expecting the position to get deeper, and that is just not happening either. So, look, there is a clear top catcher. That is Willson Contreras. He was a top 30 player in Roto last year. We only had 4 catchers in the top 100 in that format. And then in CBS head-to-head points leagues, we only had 3 catchers over 400 fantasy points. We had 9 over 300 fantasy points, and only 1 averaged 3 fantasy points per game. No surprise, that was Willson Contreras. Scott, we already got some of your thoughts there, but how do you feel overall about the catcher position here in 2025?
Yeah, so I don't love it. As I said, I do think I would be willing to pay the premium for Willson Contreras up to a point, because the gap between him and the number 2 at the position was huge. It was as big as any infield spot, let's say. At least if you look at the points league differential between Willson Contreras and number 2 at the position. So he was a distant number 1. I think the gap will be smaller this year because I think we'll see something of a bounce back for Adley Rutschman. But I still think it's a 2-year trend now of Contreras being the best. And I do think he is a clear number 1. 4th round pick if he's available there. I'm not saying I would for sure take him. It depends what else is there. But I would be okay taking Contreras in round 4. And have in some mock drafts already. Otherwise, I think it'd have to be a really good value. Adley Rutschman, I've taken as early as round 6 before. Particularly in like a 1-catcher league, I might be willing to do that because the smaller lineups, you need to find more ways to distinguish your team from everybody else. And catcher is one way of doing that. So I might go the extra mile for a Rutschman type in a 1-catcher league. But only if I love the value, and if I don't love the value, I am likely to just wait and pick up the scraps at the end.
Yeah, and that's what I've noticed whenever we do these 1-catcher mock drafts, and usually those are the head-to-head formats with 1 catcher, and then Roto uses the 2 starting catchers. In those 1-catcher leagues, I feel like if I ever take a catcher in the top 10 or 12 rounds, usually like in the last rounds of the draft, there's still a serviceable option, like a top 12 catcher that you can get later on. And I almost always regret taking one earlier. Chris, what is your strategy here in catcher in 1 versus 2 catcher leagues? Because I feel like, as Scott pointed out, it could potentially change. What are your thoughts?
I think it does probably depend on the league, because on the one hand, if you don't get I think it's Willson Contreras and Adley Rutschman in a head-to-head points league. I think are clearly ahead of the pack. Yainer Diaz, his plate discipline's not great, but we'll go over the specifics shortly enough. If you can't get one of those two at a reasonable price, you probably just wait and play chicken, and nobody's going to take a second catcher, or at least nobody should take a second catcher. And I do think there are 11 or 12 viable starters at the position. So I think it's either really early or really late.
So we didn't do catchers for tiers. We didn't devote a tiers episode specifically to the catcher position, but the way you broke it down is similar to how I actually have it in the tiers, where there is one name in the elite tier and it's Willson Contreras, and there's one name in the near elite tier and it's Adley Rutschman. And then there's a nice glob of 6, tier of 6 in the next best things after those two.
And yeah, I think it's probably 6, maybe 7. And then there's like another tier of maybe 3 after that. So like it's either you get that surefire edge with Willson Contreras or Adley Rutschman. I know Adley Rutschman had a down year, but I'm not really worried about it. I think there's a very good explanation. We'll get to it. In a roto league, I'm probably more comfortable living in the middle with both my number 1 and 2. So like taking someone in the 8-ish range. I have a couple of names in mind we'll talk about a little later. And then kind of being a little earlier on the number 2, just because there are names in the high teens that I like. There's not really a lot of guys in the 20 plus range that I think are even remotely viable. So I would hope to avoid the huge negative, which frankly, most catchers in a 15-team 2-catcher league, most of the catchers, or at least close to half, are going to be negatives on your line, on your roster.
I think we're in agreement. The way that you broke it down, Chris, and Scott, how you broke down your catcher tiers, I would like to get one of those top 7 in ADP if I can. I mean, that ends with, Will Smith, Willson Contreras in that range of ADP. If I don't, I can live with someone in the 10 to 12, like a Realmuto or Tyler Stephenson, someone like that. And that's in a 1 or 2 catcher league. Like I really want to get one of those top 7 if I can. And then, I won't get 2 in the top 7, but 1 at least. And then kind of jump back in with some, sleeper candidates in those middle rounds. I like Sean Murphy, Ivan Herrera. We'll talk about those guys a little bit later on. But
so who's in? Because it's a top 8 for me.
I think it might be a top 9.
Well, yeah, I could see you going 9.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I have 9 catchers before you get to the last resorts. So you leaving JT? You saying 7? Are you leaving JT Realmuto out?
Yeah, I would put Realmuto in.
So the top 7 in ADP is Willson Contreras, Adley Rutschman, Yainer Diaz, Raleigh, Salvador Perez, Will Smith, and Willson Contreras.
Okay, so you're leaving out JT Realmuto when you say top 7. You're leaving out Shea Langeliers. Those would be the 2 in question. I have Langeliers in a tier 2 himself, below like Realmuto and Will Smith and Raleigh and all of them. So you could say top 8 or top 9 looking at my tiers, but you kind of leave both Realmuto and Langeliers out. You see them as separate from the rest.
Yeah, I memean, like I said, I think you can live with that, but I would prefer to get one of those top 7 if I could. I just feel a little bit safer about those, and maybe some breakout appeal for someone like a Willson Contreras playing first base this year. Before we hit our first break, just a few reminders that you can always listen to Fantasy Baseball Today on Spotify. Scan the QR code if you're watching on YouTube. That will bring you right to the Spotify feed. And if you do listen on Spotify, be sure to drop a comment on today's episode. Which catcher are you targeting most this season? Let us know. We also have a mailbag podcast coming up later this week. If you want to send in a question, either email fantasybaseball@cbsi.com. That's the letter I, or leave us a 5-star rating on Apple. Drop your question in the review. We'll also break down all the news of the week on that mailbag podcast. There's just not enough time to talk about news on these position previews. Jack Flaherty just signed a 2-year deal to return to the Detroit Tigers. So obviously we'll break that down a little bit later on in the week. Let's take a quick break. When we return, we'll get to catcher ADP right after this.
Gives it to Jenkins for the championship. A 16 beats a 1. From sweet to elite to the Final Four.
Welcome back in Fantasy Baseball today. Catcher preview, and we are jumping into ADP. We're using Fantasy Pros average draft position, which takes an average of 5 different websites so far: Yahoo, CBS, RT Sports, NFBC, and Fantrax. No surprise, William Contreras is up first with an ADP of 35.2. And if that sounds a little early, that's because it is, at least compared to last year when Adley Rutschman was the first catcher off the board with an ADP of 49. Back in 2023, 2 years ago, Realmuto had an ADP of 27. So actually a little bit higher than where Contreras is right now. This is the top catcher in fantasy, prime of his career, 27 years old. I still think there's an even higher ceiling if he ever raised his launch angle, but 2 years in a row, 55% ground ball rate. I think we're kind of locked into something.
He doesn't need, though. Here's the thing. There were 8 players in the entire league last year who had as many home runs, runs, and RBI as William Contreras. There were only 8 in the entire league who had as many as him in those 3 categories.
Yep.
Of those 8, only 4 had a better batting average. Only 5 had more steals. He's not a stolen base source like JT Realmuto was at his best, but he stole 9 last year. And he's probably a better hitter than Realmuto was. Like, I'm not expecting 10 plus stolen bases from William Contreras, but it's not going to be a 0. He has 15 over the past 2 seasons. So he's just a really, really good hitter, and absolutely, I think, worth drafting at his price. I've got him in 33 in my rankings overall, and I think he deserves to be ranked higher than Adley Rutschman was last year.
Yeah.
Because Rutschman doesn't have the stolen bases.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much. Let's give him 7. Let's say William Contreras steals 7 bases this year. I in the current stolen base landscape, I'm not really turning cartwheels over that. It's not nothing, but
you don't have to
close
to cartwheel.
So it's not so much that for me. It's just William Contreras. Again, he has been the top catcher 2 years in a row. He played 155 games last year. So he's a huge source of volume at a position where that's a major concern. If you just look at how many points William Contreras scored last year in head-to-head points, he would have been second at every other infield position. As a catcher,
yeah, you don't have to adjust
every first baseman but one, every second baseman but one, every third baseman, every shortstop but one. That is insane production from that position. And again, it's basically 2 years in a row that he's done it. 2 years at close to that volume anyway. It's 3 years in a row.
Yeah, 3 years at that per game volume.
Right. In fact, his career high OPS was actually 2022 with Atlanta when he was a part-timer. So like, this is legit what Contreras does with the bat. Catchers get banged up, and it's possible that he has an early regression because of that. But I think as much as you can bank on any catcher being a stud, I think William Contreras specifically is there.
And let me be very clear. I don't think he needs to get better. I just want more. I want more. If he just lowered that ground ball rate to 50%, he might hit 30 home runs. And
but he might sacrifice some batting average. Like this is one where I'm not going to ask for more, like this is enough.
Yeah.
What he does.
Any concern that he loses any DH games in 2025, because Christian Yelich is coming back from back surgery, and it feels pretty seamless to just kind of throw Yelich at the DH spot, which maybe limits the playing time upside for William Contreras. What do you guys think?
I don't think Yelich is going to be a full-time DH. So, even if it's only a few times a week in the outfield, and it might just be full-time, I'm not sure. But even if Yelich plays half his games at DH, that still leaves plenty for William Contreras. I'm not worried because it's 30-ish games at DH per year since he got to Milwaukee. They can find that even if Yelich is playing plenty of DH. That would not scare me off at all. I think there's just a little bit of room for regression. Like, he's gotten a little bit better every year, and you can't necessarily always expect that. But No, I think there are about as few concerns as you can have with a player. It's just, is he worth picking ahead of guys at positions that are less volatile?
Yeah.
You know, that's the biggest concern here.
So he's going William Contreras just ahead of Manny Machado at third base. And then, Corbin Burns, Garrett Crochet, starting pitchers, obviously very volatile. I think Jose Altuve was the next hitter up after that. So you're kind of on the edge of what feels like another hitter tier there. I don't think I would take him ahead of Manny Machado, but if you ask me Contreras versus Jose Altuve, I probably would go with Contreras there. So just to give you some perspective on that. Let's drop down a few rounds. You have Adley Rutschman with an ADP of 64 and Yainer Diaz with an ADP of 73.6. So that round 6 or 7 range in a 12-team league. Adley Rutschman, a down season, feels like it was completely tied to a hand injury that he suffered on June 27th. For some perspective, through June 27th, Adley Rutschman was batting 300 with 15 home runs and an 830 OPS.
Yeah, he was making the leap.
Yeah, from June 28th on, he hit 189 with 4 home runs and a 559 OPS. To his credit, he did not blame his down season on injury, but it feels like a pretty obvious point in the season where something could have happened to Adley Rutschman. Scott, do you buy the injury excuse, and are you looking to draft Rutschman at a slight discount this year compared to where he was last year?
I think it's a plausible explanation. I'm not giving him credit for not using it as an excuse, because I prefer clarity in all in all situations. And if Adley Rutschman says, "Yeah, I wasn't feeling right after taking that foul tip off the hand, and it screwed up my swing or whatever," I actually feel better if he came out and said that. But he hasn't. I think it's perfectly fine to theorize since the drop off aligns so closely to it. He missed a game with that injury?
I don't think he even missed a game.
Yeah. So it's a little weird, but catchers are known for playing through all kinds of bumps and bruises. And so presumably that's what was going on, because Rutschman, former number 1 overall pick, came up to the majors and did exactly what he was supposed to do right away. It was just a very seamless transition for a very high-end catcher prospect. And the most out-of-character stretch of his entire professional career was those last 3 months of last season. So 60th, he's about the 60th player drafted on average, right? That would put him at the end of round 5. Like I said, it's usually round 6 before I'm looking to take him. So I still want a discount, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like this obvious slap you in the face kind of discount when it comes to Rutschman.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the easiest calls in fantasy this year, the Rutschman bounce back. It's like Ronald Acuna coming off the torn ACL when he had the down year. This was a guy who looked like he was going to be an MVP caliber player for the next 8 years. And then in the middle of his physical prime, he has a down season with an injury that I think is a reasonable excuse. He was on a 32 homer, 206 run plus RBI pace before that injury while hitting 300. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just going to bet on the mid-20s MVP caliber player bouncing back from a down year.
In a really good lineup, in a ballpark that should be more conducive for power. They're pulling in the left field walls in Camden this season. A question I'm going to try and quickly ask for each of these players in these previews is whether or not this player is better for roto or head-to-head points. I know we have people that play in many different formats. Adley feels like he would be fine in both, but he's probably slightly better in a points league, right?
Yeah, because he's, at least in a typical year, he's fantastic with plate discipline, a near 1-to-1 strikeout to walk ratio in 2023. And he falls a little short in home runs. That's the one thing you wish there were more of, but you don't mind it so much in points leagues because there are plenty of other ways he can accumulate points for you.
Let's move down to Yainer Diaz, who has an ADP of 73.6. He took a step back from his rookie season, mostly thanks to a slow start. But from June on, Yainer Diaz hit 324 with 13 home runs and an 830 OPS. He's not perfect. He chases a ton of pitches outside of the zone. Even with that, he does maintain a very reasonable strikeout rate. The ground ball rate also spiked up last season. But if that ground ball rate kind of reverses back to what we saw in 2023, Chris, I think Yainer Diaz has catcher one upside because he makes so much contact, because he's going to hit for a good batting average. If the ground ball rate is in the 40 to 45% range, I think we can get 25 plus home runs from Yainer Diaz in, a pretty solid Astros lineup. What are your thoughts here on Diaz?
And the nice thing about Yainer Diaz, based on what he's shown in his first 2 MLB seasons, is whether it's the power forward version of him from 2023 or the version we saw in 2024, he's going to be very good, because when he hit for less power in 2024, what he did, he hit 299. That's a huge number to get from your catcher position, where even really good must-start catchers are going to hit 225. So I think this is a good bet to make. It's less of a sure thing than Adley Rutschman or Willson Contreras, but I think he's firmly in the next tier. And yeah, if he does manage to put them together, if he manages to hit the ball in the air a little more without sacrificing the batting average, I think we could be looking at a huge outcome. And I think Yainer Diaz is kind of Salvador Perez, like horrible plate discipline. Not someone you want your kids to emulate if you want them to have a high on-base percentage. He just swings at everything. But the quality of contact and contact skills are so good that it almost doesn't matter. And I do think there is a 30-homer ceiling for Yainer Diaz.
Mm-hmm. And it feels like the Astros like him quite a bit as well. 619 plate appearances were 5th most at the position last season. And, he got some games at DH. He got some games at first base as well. I mean, those are going to be harder to come by with Christian Walker, and Yordan Alvarez sounds like will play a little bit more DH, but obviously the Astros are pretty excited here. Yainer Diaz, I think he's useful in both formats, maybe slightly better in Roto just because that
better in Roto, yeah.
plate discipline isn't so good.
Yeah, the lack of walks. I mean, we're talking
near league worst walk rate, yeah.
Right, 5th percentile walk rate. And so Yainer Diaz 2.63 head-to-head points per game last year. Cal Raleigh, even as much as he strikes out, had more than that. So Yainer Diaz still an obvious must-start player in points leagues, top 6 catcher, let's say, but not as I don't have as much enthusiasm for him in that format.
All right, 2 catchers going close to one another are Cal Raleigh at an ADP of 91.8 and Salvador Perez at ADP 94.8. And that's round 8 of a 12-team league for both of those guys. Cal Raleigh just finished as a top 3 catcher in Roto and head-to-head points last season. Seems to have settled in as the premier power bat at the position. 27-plus home runs 3 years in a row for Cal Raleigh. He got up to a career-high 34 last season, and it's all supported by a massive 15% barrel rate. Best at the position by far. It's not close. Cal Raleigh's going to hit for a lot of power. Scott, is Raleigh someone that you plan to target in your drafts?
Yeah, with more enthusiasm this year than ever, because I feel like the past couple years I was skeptical. He struck out a ton, and it just seemed like the batting average was in a really precarious spot. It kind of reminded me of Mike Zunino, the way he would sometimes make a splash with the power, but it always felt like he was walking a tightrope, and he wasn't a useful fantasy commodity for long. But Raleigh has basically done the exact same thing 3 years in a row now. And what is really, I mean, I guess this was kind of true of Zunino too, but just comparing to Cal Raleigh to catchers who are playing currently, the defense stands out so much that it keeps him in the lineup almost every day. It's sort of like Willson Contreras, the playing time Cal Raleigh gets. He had 100 RBI last year.
I think he caught more games than anyone in baseball last year.
Yeah, probably. And 100 RBI from a catcher in a bad lineup, no less. And that, 100 RBI, 73 runs is a pretty good total for a catcher. The previous year it was 75 RBI, 78 runs. Those are also good totals for a catcher. The 100 RBI might be an outlier, but the point is Cal Raleigh will give you a lot in those counting stats. So even if he is a liability in batting average, very likely to lead the position in home runs and give you a significant contribution in runs and RBI.
maybe this is a mistake. I just feel like I'd never wind up with a catcher like Cal Raleigh or Shea Langeliers just because I worry about what they do to your batting average.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you can insulate that a little bit depending on who you take earlier on. If you get Yordan Alvarez, Freddie Freeman, Vlad Jr., any of those early round bats that contribute batting average, it obviously makes it easier to take someone like Cal Raleigh.
Yeah.
And I will point out, from a head-to-head points perspective, he walks a lot. So the OBP is actually really good. And I don't know that I would say he's a better points league player than Roto, but I think it's pretty close.
No.
I mean, he probably could be useful in both, but the OBP helps.
Yeah, it's more the counting. I'm sorry, it's more the strikeouts that keep him from being a true standout in points league. Even though he gets all that volume, he's fine. He's sort of like Yainer Diaz. They're fine starters, but I wouldn't be looking to break the bank for them. The batting average point, him hurting you. Yeah, I mean he's going to hit between 220 and 230. That's not good. Most catchers are going to be a liability in batting average,
Yeah.
Willson Contreras, Adley Rutschman, Yainer Diaz, the three we talked about. Okay, they're probably going to help in batting average, but apart from that, catchers are more likely to hurt you than help you. So I don't get stuck on that with Raleigh. It may just be that I don't love the price anymore because nobody's overlooking him. But in a vacuum, I don't worry so much about the batting average for Raleigh.
It is worth pointing out that the thing that makes him so valuable makes his batting average hurt even more, though. And that's the playing time edge, because he's going to have a real big number. Like most catchers who hurt you in batting average are doing so in 380 at bats. Cal Raleigh's probably doing it, and I'm going to guess off the top of my head, like 550 last year.
He has the fourth most plate appearances over the past 2 seasons at catchers, so right around 1,200. So he's
and even though he walks a lot, it's still a really high number of at bats, which is the relevant number. 546 last year.
Yep.
Which is the relevant number for Roto League.
Yep. Let's move on to Salvador Perez, who managed to stay healthy last season, and he bounced back. He was a top 3 catcher in both formats. But can Salvador Perez avoid father time? He is turning 35 years old in May. There were no signs of a cliff here for Salvador Perez. His plate discipline and quality of contact were actually both very strong last season. The only thing I didn't love was that he got off to an awesome start in April and then just kind of okay from May on. 253 batting average with a 736 OPS for Salvador Perez. Chris, do you see yourself targeting Perez with an ADP of 94.8, just inside the top 100?
Betting against Salvador Perez over the past half decade has gone really poorly. There's basically been one bad season since he turned 30, which is pretty remarkable given he's a catcher, and a catcher who has played just a ton of games and innings. And, you do wonder at what point he can keep outrunning, but even the bad years are like 250 and 23 homers with decent counting stats. So I think it's very unlikely he's as good as he was last year. Like you said, it was a little front loaded. He was more like a 760, 770 OPS after April, but he's going to have a time advantage over basically everyone at the position. He plays in a good lineup, but a lineup that I think will be worse. I think he'll be worse than last year. All in all, I think it's fine. There's a catcher going a little later that I like a lot more for the price, but I don't know, man. I don't want to keep betting on Salvador Perez because at some point it will run out, but it just being skeptical of him hasn't really worked out lately.
And that playing time advantage is massive, which you mentioned. 652 plate appearances last season, 158 total games for a catcher eligible player. It helps that he got 49 games in at first base, 24 at DH.
And that could get walked back a little bit because I would assume a lot of those first base games were in the second half of the season when Vinny Pasquantino was out.
Right.
But even
either way, like their lineup isn't that good to the point where they can just play Salvador Perez at DH, and Freddie Freeman is actually a good defender.
They have a fine backup,
So they can just play, they want to give Salvi a half day off, boom, DH, he's still playing all the time.
That was what I was concerned about with Salvador Perez last year. Is they're he's still playing as much as ever, but he's playing less and less at catcher, and he's really kind of a liability there. And Freddie Fermin is as good of a backup as there is in the sport. But I think the last couple of years have shown that the Royals are committed to finding at bats for Salvador Perez, whether it's a DH, whether it's at first base, and that'll remain an advantage for him at this position. I would put him second only to Cal Raleigh in terms of power expectation, home run expectations at the position, and probably first among any catcher in terms of RBI.
Yeah.
He'll bring you down in batting average. He'll bring you down in runs, especially, but maybe less than it seems because of how much he plays.
And batting average is not like runs. Yeah, he had the 1 year where he has 88. That's the only year where he scored more than 60 runs, which is kind of bonkers for how much he plays. But Salvador Perez is glacially slow and has a 303 career OBP. It's about as bad a combination for scoring runs as you could ask for, but makes a ton of contact, hits the ball in the air. Good skill set for RBI. And the batting
average is I wasn't giving him enough credit there.
Yeah, early in his career there were some 230-ish seasons, but he's been no lower than 255 since 2018. I think he's just a solid source of batting average. Not helping, not hurting, but not hurting is helping at catcher because most catchers hurt you.
Last 4 years, 264 batting average. Yeah. So that's about what I'd expect.
Better in roto categories or head-to-head points?
Way better in categories.
Agree.
All right. Let's move on to two more catchers that are going right next to each other in ADP. Will Smith with an ADP of 111 and Willson Contreras ADP of 111.6. That is the 10th round of a 12-team league, and Will Smith has finished as a top 5 catcher 4 years in a row. Very similar season over the past 2 years, between 19 and 20 home runs, between 77 and 80 runs, between 75 and 76 RBI. The only difference, the batting average dropped to a career low 248 for Will Smith. And like Salvador Perez, Smith had this awesome April, but from May on, he hit 216 with a 707.
Pretty bad.
He's not a target for me personally, but I am open to drafting him if he falls past ADP. Scott, what do you think about Will Smith?
This is the first year where I feel like the drafting consensus has been fade Will Smith, because it always seemed like the consensus was higher on him than I was, because I don't know, it just seemed like people were expecting him to take this step forward or maybe play more. He had that 1 year before Shohei Ohtani joined the Dodgers where he got a lot of DH time. And I think that was his most valuable season in fantasy. But then, of course, Ohtani's getting all the DH bats now. So that's not an option for Will Smith. He is the first catcher I think we've mentioned here who has playing time concerns. He played 128 games last year. That's fine as a catcher, but when you've got all these other guys playing 140 plus games, it drops Will Smith behind them. And that's what we're seeing here.
About a 10% reduction in playing time for him versus the other guys.
So I guess what I'm saying is Will Smith is priced more appropriately now, and because of that, I might actually be more likely to draft him.
Do you guys think that there is a sneaky low floor here because they have a top catcher prospect in Dalton Rushing? I mean, is there any chance Will Smith, if he's just bad, that they go to a rookie in Dalton Rushing at some point?
Are they going to bench the guy who's under contract for 7 more seasons?
And I don't think
is that really a risk? I don't think
that
so.
That extension is crazy to me.
Right? Like it was like a 9-year extension before last year. Are there 8 years left on that contract?
He is signed through 2033. So yeah, they are committed to Will Smith for the long haul. Now, the Dalton Rushing thing is interesting because clearly he's ready for a major league look. They were giving him some time in left field. I don't think that's so much because Rushing can't cut it as a catcher. It's just, he's not replacing Will Smith. So I think it's more likely that Rushing plays this hybrid role than, maybe serves as the backup to Will Smith and a part-time outfielder, or that Dalton Rushing, what happens to him is what happens to so many Dodgers prospects lately, and he just becomes trade bait.
I do also think there is a chance for like 12 DH appearances for Will Smith, because there might be some times where Shohei Ohtani gets the day off after he starts. I don't know how likely it is, but it's possible. They have the flexibility to do it. Certainly. Ohtani won't be starting until like May. I think it's pretty much been confirmed. So
as a pitcher,
as a pitcher. So that might not be a thing early on in the season, but it wouldn't shock me if that happened a handful of times.
Will Smith better in categories or head-to-head points?
Points.
Probably points.
But I think he's okay in both, right?
Yeah, it's so like his point per game average 2.86. That's more than Salvi and Yainer and Raleigh, but he plays fewer games.
Yeah. I think the way I'm looking at Will Smith is like he's not a difference maker anymore. Mm-hmm. You don't have to pay a difference maker's price for him, so it's fine.
Somebody who might be a difference maker this year, someone I think Chris and I are going to be duking it out for a lot this season, is Willson Contreras. Big news this offseason, Willson Contreras will play first base for the Cardinals. Obviously, this is huge because it offers playing time advantage as an everyday player. And I think playing first base might actually help Contreras stay healthier than playing catcher. I mean, he's dealt with a lot of lower leg issues, some ankle stuff, some knee stuff in the past. So keeping him upright at first base, I think could help with the health of Willson Contreras. And he's still a great offensive producer. He has the second highest OPS and third highest ISO among catchers over the past 3 years, minimum 1,000 plate appearances. The strikeout rate did jump up, swinging strike rate, the highest of his career. So, all right, as he gets older, that's worrisome. But Chris, I mean, the advantages of playing time and the fact that I think the bat is still really good, Willson Contreras looks like a nice buy at this cost.
Yeah, he made my breakouts column, which is maybe surprising because he's going to be 33 pretty early on this season. But I think it just comes down to that playing time. He has remained a really impactful bat into his 30s. I mean, since he turned 30, he has like an 821 OPS. And he's averaged like 29 homers per 162 games. And he'll even steal a few bases. I'm not expecting Willson Contreras to play 150 games. And there's some downside risk that he's just totally untenable at first base, although he does have a decent amount of experience playing there over the course of his career. So I do expect him to be okay. But I think 150 games is possible. Maybe not likely. Again, 33 with the long history of injuries, but 150 games is possible, which you can't say about a lot of catchers. I think 30 home runs is a very, very high end, but possible outcome for Willson Contreras. I think he should be in a really good lineup spot. He gets on base. He had a 380 OBP last year, walked a career high 12.6% of the time. I think there's a chance that Willson Contreras is just a top 3 catcher in both points and roto. And that's with Adley Rutschman and Willson Contreras having very good seasons. I think the ceiling is absolutely that high. It might be as high as anyone not named William or Adley.
Well, this is something that's commonly overlooked in fantasy, is the catcher who becomes a full-time player elsewhere, the established catcher who becomes a full-time player elsewhere. And even if he's not particularly, even if he's not a standout at catcher for fantasy, he often becomes it that first year where he's retaining his catcher eligibility. I remember the year Stephen Vogt moved off catcher, and he was a monster for fantasy that year. Or maybe I'm getting it backwards. Maybe he was picking up. I don't know. The point is, when they get more playing time, even if they're not standouts already, they become fantasy standouts. And Willson Contreras is kind of already a fantasy standout. You mentioned the OPS from year to year, mid-800s, low to mid-800s. If you look at his Baseball Savant page, compare it to William Contreras, Willson and William, remarkably close. Yep. The biggest difference has been playing time. And the reason Willson Contreras hasn't gotten William Contreras' playing time is mainly injury related. Yeah, you look at his injury history. It's IL stint every year, basically. And that's when you're catching, of course. Those guys get beat up. A first baseman, I think he has. I think the main reason to like Willson Contreras this year is because you just take what he's already done as a catcher, but without that IL stint or two that costs him the playing time. And yeah, he's there's a good chance he's top 3 at this position this year.
And he's my number 5 player for the record. I'm very, very high on Willson Contreras.
Yeah, you and I both have him 5th, and Scott has Willson Contreras 6th at the position. Better in categories or head-to-head points? Willson Contreras.
I don't think there's any significant edge in either. I think he should be great in both.
He could chip in a handful of steals too. So yeah, I think he's probably just serviceable in both formats. Let's take a quick break. When we return, back into catcher ADP right after this.
I feel home when I see the faces that remember my own. When I'm with my friends, I feel home.
Welcome back in Fantasy Baseball Today. Catcher preview here in 2025. And we are continuing on with Fantasy Pros ADP. We left off with Willson Contreras, the 7th catcher off the board. And this is where ADP starts to open up a little bit. 3 catchers going between rounds 12 and 14. Shea Langeliers with an ADP of 137, Logan O'Hoppe, ADP of 147, and JT Realmuto with an ADP of 160. Shea Langeliers feels like 80% Cal Raleigh. Langeliers made big strides last season. He improved his plate discipline. He posted career highs across the board in batting average, home runs, RBI, and OPS. And Scott, I think there might be some untapped upside here for Langeliers. His career in Oakland Coliseum, 198 batting average, 643 OPS. Career on the road, 232 batting average, 770 OPS. Athletics playing their games in Sacramento this year, minor league ballpark. We think it'll be slightly better of a hitting environment than in Oakland Coliseum. What do you think? Is there another level that Shea Langeliers can get to here?
Possibly. Yeah, I could see that batting average creeping up a little bit. More like 240 than 225, let's say. I don't think it's going to be entirely transformative. I think the same structure, the shape of his production will basically be the same, even if there's some slight improvement. He plays a lot. Again, he maybe doesn't deserve to because he's not so stellar on the defensive end, particularly in terms of like framing and blocking. Throws well, but you know, he could use some help back there behind the plate, but he plays on the Athletics, and I think they're just going to let him play. So that's a big part of Langeliers' appeal too. Bad plate discipline, that's going to keep his batting average subpar, and it's going to bring down his points league value. But he's kind of a poor man's Cal Raleigh, and I think as long as you approach him like that, it'll be fine.
Shea Langeliers better in a roto or categories league, right? Because of the strikeout rate.
Yeah. Yes.
Cool. Let's move on to Logan O'Hoppe, who did some nice things in his first full season. He hit 244 with 20 home runs, solid quality of contact. Did underperform his expected stats, but strikeouts were a major issue. Nearly 30%. Strikeout rate, lots of swinging strikes so far in his career. And now the Angels have Travis d'Arnaud backing him up, who is better than your average backup catcher, obviously. I doubt there will be many DH opportunities on this team with Jorge Soler. Mike Trout had 2 meniscus surgeries last year, so they probably want to get him some DH at-bats when they could. Chris, I really want to like Logan O'Hoppe, but it feels like maybe the upside is capped here. What do you think?
Yeah, Logan O'Hoppe is my bust pick at the catcher position. I'm just not a huge fan of the skill set. It's very all or nothing power, but it's not quite the Cal Raleigh or even Shea Langeliers power. We have seen that stretch in 2023 where he played at a really high level, but then he comes back in 2024 and is a 20 homer guy. And it just, I don't know. It's like not a great lineup. It's a decent park, but I think it's the Travis d'Arnaud thing that really could prove really risky, because Travis d'Arnaud is, I think, a starting caliber catcher who is overqualified to be a backup. And rightly or wrongly, the Angels jumped the market. Was he the first player signed this offseason? It was one of the first players signed back in like mid-October. And so They clearly value him, and I think there's a chance that Logan O'Hoppe is just a guy this season. I'm not really all that excited about him.
Definitely better.
Did you give the second half stats, Frank?
He also collapsed in the second half.
Yeah,
him, but it was really August that stood out. I mean, an 0.99 batting average, 45% strikeout rate in August.
Yeah, he was a sub 200 hitter over the final 3 months, and was one of 4 catchers that I see that just collapsed at one point of the season. We mentioned Adley Rutschman and Will Smith already. Logan O'Hoppe was one. Ryan Jeffers was another. And we only have a semblance of an explanation for Adley Rutschman with that foul tip on the hand. You can kind of presume, since they're catchers, that they were playing through something in every case, but the fact you have to presume that is worrisome. I was willing to give O'Hoppe the benefit of the doubt until the Angels signed Travis d'Arnaud, and I think it's just going to be the same frustration for O'Hoppe in fantasy that it's been for Sean Murphy the past couple years.
All right, let's take a look at JT Realmuto, who is entering his age 34 season, and he missed time last year with a torn meniscus in his knee, but pretty similar numbers year over year from 2023, except for the steals, which went from 16 all the way down to 2. So where Realmuto really used to separate himself from the rest of the catcher position, that was not an advantage for him last year. Still 79th percentile sprint speed, so is there a chance the speed could bounce back? Or do they just want him to run less after he had that knee surgery? I think a fair question moving forward. It also sounds like the Phillies want to decrease Realmuto's workload. They want to give him an extra day off per week as he, moves into his mid-30s here, which, again, it just kind of caps the upside if we're not getting huge playing time numbers here from JT Realmuto. Even with all that said, Scott, ADP at 160 doesn't sound terrible for someone who's still a pretty good hitter when you look under the hood.
Yeah, this seems like going overboard and downgrading him. When I started ranking my players in October, no ADP data available yet, obviously, and I thought, okay, this is the year where we got to drop Realmuto down the rankings. So I was there, and then I see where he's actually going, and it's like, I wasn't dropping him that far down the rankings. I wasn't putting him behind Logan O'Hoppe or even Shea Langeliers. It's notable that he came back from the torn meniscus and was great. He was better after it than before it, which a lot of times you see players hurry back from that surgery and they're just messed up the rest of the year. Realmuto squatting behind the plate, the last 2 months, his OPS was around 825. It was, Willson Contreras level. So yeah, maybe he's not a base stealer anymore. You mentioned he still runs fast, so he could get it back. I'm not counting on it, but he's still just a good hitter.
Mm-hmm.
And not at what he once was, but plenty good enough to start for me, and probably the best value pick at the position, at least that we've covered so far.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all that.
Better in categories or head-to-head points at this point?
Pretty similar in both, I think.
I do think there's a lot is hinging on the steals in Roto. I think there's a chance he gets back to 10. Not 23, was it 2 years ago, or 16?
16, yep.
But
8 to 10, something like that.
Yeah, 8 to 10 for a guy who's still this athletic. That feels perfectly reasonable to me.
Let's move on to the rounding out the top 12 catchers. Our 2 names going right around pick 180, Francisco Alvarez and Tyler Stephenson. Alvarez, a former top prospect, took a step back in his second season, perhaps derailed by injury. Had surgery on his left thumb in April. He returned in June. He dealt with some shoulder soreness in July. Eventually did get things going. Finished strong in September. Alvarez did 254, 5 home runs, 17 RBI, a 900 OPS. Chris, is that enough to buy back in on Alvarez as your catcher 1 if you decide to wait a little bit at the position?
This might be a hot take, but I have him ranked ahead of Logan O'Hoppe. Very similar ranges, around 160, 170 overall, but I think I buy fractured thumb in April, shoulder injury in the summer as being pretty good excuses for why the power just completely disappeared for Francisco Alvarez. Because remember, even though 2023 wasn't like the huge season we hoped it would be, he had 25 homers as a 21-year-old. That's pretty good. All of a sudden, he takes a step back last year. I think betting on a bounce back here, knowing that, look, the floor is not super high. I understand that. But I think betting on the bounce back, betting on him tapping into that power a little more consistently, I am growing more bullish on Francisco Alvarez as the offseason goes on. I started out pretty down on him, but I think everyone else is too down on him now.
Better in categories or head-to-head points?
Absolutely better in categories.
Yeah. Again, that is Francisco Alvarez. Let's move on to Tyler Stephenson, who bounced back after a down 2023, posted career highs in home runs with 19, runs 69, RBI 66. He also hit the ball harder than ever before with a career high 9% barrel rate, which is not great, but it's pretty good for a catcher, especially when you play your home games in Cincinnati. Scott, this feels like more of a floor play than a ceiling with Tyler Stephenson. I think I'd expect something in between 2023 and 2024. 250 to 260, 15 to 17 home runs, and solid counting stats.
Exactly. I see Tyler Stephenson as sort of the minimum acceptable standard for a starter in a one-catcher league. Like he's obviously not setting you apart in the position, but he's fine. You plug him in.
He's fine. He's just fine, but he's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, feels similar in roto and head-to-head points, right? Just a fine.
Decent plate discipline, but not like exemplary. He's fine.
Yep. All right. Well, let's move on to sleepers, breakouts, and busts. We will come back to ADP a little bit later on at the position, but let's keep things moving here. And sleeper at catcher, Scott, we will start with you.
Sleeper at catcher, I think the obvious one is Ivan Herrera. I guess you could call him.
Don't say it.
Don't say it because you don't want me to take. I almost said give it to Chris. You know what? Give it to Chris first.
Chris, Ivan Herrera.
There you go.
Cardinals catcher. Look, the only thing that I really have a question is he actually the starting catcher? Because Pedro Paz is a very good defensive player. He's got decent minor league numbers of his own. I could be talked into the overall impact of him making him a more viable number one catcher for the Cardinals than Herrera. But Herrera is such a strong hitter that like he had a 414 OBP in his career at AAA. He had a 366 expected WOBA last year. I believe that was the highest of any player at the catcher position. It might be close with Willson Contreras and him, but Ivan Herrera hit the ball hard. He has good plate discipline. He just about does everything you want. And he did have a better ex-WOBA than Willson Contreras. That tells you a lot. I'm not saying he's going to be better than Willson Contreras, but I think Ivan Herrera is a fine fallback for your number one catcher if you want to wait, and a phenomenal number two catcher. And he's my plan A as my number two catcher in pretty much all two catcher leagues.
Projections all have Ivan Herrera for around 100 games, which I think is fair. If we get a 162 game split between Herrera and Pages, I think that's a fair expectation. But in those 100 games, I think Herrera could hit for a good batting average, 10-ish home runs, chip in a handful of steals. He's just a really sneaky play. I really like him as a catcher too, as well. Scott,
I really like. I think there is a like Willson Contreras trajectory that's possible. It's not likely, but the way he impacts the ball, it's legitimately possible.
And there is built-in upside if the team just views him as the everyday catcher. If he just gets off to a great start, maybe if he improves defensively, you know, if he plays 120, 130 games, then I mean, there could be pretty big upside here for someone like Ivan Herrera. Scott, over to you, a sleeper not named Ivan Herrera.
So I let me preface this by saying we put our sleepers 1.0, breakouts 1.0, busts 1.0 out there. I did not have a catcher on any of those three lists. So for the most part, I think everyone at this position is being valued appropriately. and I don't have any takes that are that far outside the norm. But I will choose to highlight Sean Murphy here.
Homer.
I think it's telling that the Braves they had an option on Travis d'Arnaud that they declined. They could have brought him back for a modest sum. I can't remember exactly.
It was like $8 million. Yeah, it was pretty reasonable.
And they chose to decline it, even though, good clubhouse presence, all that. There'd been some talk that maybe he was in line to replace Brian Snitker someday as the manager. They let him go. And I think that shows a lot of confidence in Sean Murphy. Partly they were looking to trim money any way they can, but they traded for Sean Murphy. They gave up Willson Contreras to get him, actually. They signed him to this long-term deal. And I think there was some frustration from the beginning because Brian Snitker he played Travis d'Arnaud so often, and they weren't able to recoup all that value for Sean Murphy that they were supposed to be getting. Health hasn't helped. On opening day last year, he suffered a bad oblique injury. And so, you look at
2 months with an oblique.
Yeah, you look at the data. The data's down. He didn't hit the ball nearly as hard as he used to, but I don't know that he was ever quite right. He comes in, he has an open lane for the catcher job, a clean bill of health, plenty of incentive for the Braves to play him. And this is a guy we considered a top 5 catcher a couple years ago. So I think he's going 14th at the position on average. I wish it was a little lower than that, but I think that's still there's still a lot of value potentially in that pick.
Yeah, Sean Murphy, ADP 226.4, 14th catcher off the board. I should have mentioned with Ivan Herrera, the ADP 298.4 as the 18th catcher off the board. We are in complete agreement. I think Sean Murphy's season derailed by injury last year. And I've read some articles that say the Braves could play him at catcher 120 or 130 games this year. So they are really looking at him to be their kind of workhorse behind the plate, assuming health in Sean Murphy.
Of course, I will note their top hitting prospect is also a catcher who's about ready to graduate at AAA, Drake Baldwin. So it's possible this plays out another way. Sean Murphy stinks again, and Drake Baldwin gets a lot more playing time than we're anticipating today. So if you want a deep sleeper, Drake Baldwin.
Sounds like a case of survival of the fittest.
I'll give you I'll give you a deep sleeper as well. Augustin Ramirez of the Miami Marlins. He was a breakout prospect last year, actually in the Yankees organization, traded over to the Marlins in the Jazz Chisholm deal. He's 23 years old. Last season, 25 homers, 22 steals in the minors. So could be a very fantasy friendly skill set here. He got up to 58 games at AAA. The Marlins are trotting out Nick Fortes as their catcher. So, I mean, I think Ramirez, if he has a good spring, he could be in the running for opening day. You don't really want to rely on prospect catchers, obviously, but in deeper 2-catcher leagues, I think he might make an impact at some point this season. That is Augustin Ramirez. Scott, over to you for a breakout. Anybody come to mind?
Not an exciting name here, but I think Alejandro Kirk technically would meet the definition of a breakout. He had also, kind of like Sean Murphy, had suffered from being in a catching tandem, and we were frustrated with how few at-bats he was getting with Danny Jansen there. Danny Jansen got traded to, I think it was to the Red Sox, right?
Yes.
And that allowed Alejandro Kirk to take over as the starter finally. And while he didn't perform amazing in the role, he was competent. He got his, I'm trying to find the exact stat. I thought I had it pulled up here. Hang on. Alejandro Kirk. Okay, so he had an OPS around 750 from the time of the Jansen trade, which is pretty good for a catcher. He still makes a lot of contact. He still makes pretty hard contact. The defensive metrics on Kirk are actually phenomenal. So that's all the more reason it was frustrating that he lost so many at-bats to Danny Jansen. I don't think he's going to be like a number 1 type catcher in fantasy. I think in points leagues, it's possible he could sneak in there because the strikeout rate is so low. But I think in 2-catcher leagues, Kirk could be a really good pickup.
The ADP for Alejandro Kirk, 301.6 as the 19th catcher off the board. I kind of feel like maybe he could be similar to Gabriel Moreno, and he's going 40 picks later. The playing time will be there this year. He got better last season. Good batting average, 10-ish homers, 50 RBI, something like that. I think that's a pretty fair projection for Alejandro Kirk. Chris, over to you. Breakout. I think we all know who you're going with.
Yeah, it's Willson Contreras. We already made the case. If we want to go with someone else, Austin Wells, I think has some breakout potential. Underlying numbers were quite a bit better than what he actually produced last year. I think there's 20 plus homer upside for a left-handed bat at Yankee Stadium. I could see Austin Wells taking a sizable step forward in really year 2.
Yeah, and I understand he has bad lefty splits so far in his career. I don't know if that's something he's going to improve much on, but I think there is serious playing time upside here. The backup catcher for the Yankees right now is Alex Jackson. He's bad. He's not a major leaguer. Like he's not going to get as much playing time as someone like Jose Trevino did for the Yankees last year. So I think there's some pretty big playing time upside for Austin Wells, and could potentially hit 250, 20-ish home runs this upcoming season. Breakout for me was also Willson Contreras, but we also spoke about him. Let's take a look at a bust. Chris, back to you. A bust at the catcher position.
It is Logan O'Hoppe. I kind of like, but don't love the skill set. I think there's playing time risk. We went over it all. I think he is among players being drafted. It's more overvalued. I think he's like the clear overvalued catcher among the top 12. He's number 11 for me, so it's not like I hate him, but I'd rather take the chance on Francisco Alvarez. Yeah, especially at the price difference.
Yeah, and Logan O'Hoppe at 147.4 ADP, Francisco Alvarez 179.8. So about a 30 pick gap between the two, and you like Alvarez straight up. Scott, a bust at the catcher position.
Man, I am really straining here to find someone else to talk about. O'Hoppe feels like the obvious one. You know what?
Here, Connor Wong. He's only catcher 17, but who cares? Connor Wong's not that good.
I was completely out once when they still had Kyle Teal in the organization. Yeah. Now that they traded him away, I think the playing time is safe.
They really like him. I think he started a game at second base at one point last year. It's weird. I don't think he's very good, but they're all so cheap that it's hard to plant a flag,
That's the thing. I could have brought up Ryan Jeffers here, who loses more playing time than you'd like with Christian Vasquez there, and I gave the stat before about how bad Ryan Jeffers was down the stretch. 198 with a 616 OPS in his final 86 games. So do I want to call Ryan Jeffers a bust? Well, he's like the 18th catcher off the board.
Yeah, it's like the 240th pick. It's like, who cares,
Yeah, 283 for Ryan Jeffers. So
it could be
a good name to highlight. It could be a good name to highlight, Scott, just in 2 catcher leagues. Just avoid this guy because
I think Connor Wong is the better choice for that anyway. You're right. I'm a little less concerned with Kyle Teal gone, but you look at his StatCast page; it's icicles everywhere. 11th percentile exit velocity, 24th percentile expected batting average. 231 was the expected batting average versus 280 is what he actually hit. So it just seems like there's obvious regression.
He might have been the biggest overperformer by xWOBA in the entire league last year, actually.
I can check that.
And again, that is Connor Wong that we're talking about, an ADP of 238, the 20th catcher off the board right now.
Second biggest.
Who is the biggest? You got to give it
Dalton Varsho.
Dalton Varsho.
Well,
no longer has catcher eligibility, by the way.
I don't know if I have a higher.
Yeah, I have
a lower qualification threshold because the top one was Tyler Fitzgerald, then Dalton Varsho, then Connor Wong.
I'm going to give people an unpopular name here. Brewers fans are going to kill me. I'm just not going to be the person to draft William Contreras in the 3rd or 4th round. I think he could be worthy of that pick, but there's just inherently more risk drafting a catcher that high. They suffer more injuries than other positions. It's just never going to be me. And I think there's a non-zero chance that his brother, Willson Contreras, can come close to his production, and you're getting him 80 picks later in drafts. So it's not going to be me on William Contreras. Just give me a name here. Most likely to draft your catcher 1, most likely to draft the season.
Willson Contreras.
Scott?
I am going to say, I'm going to say Willson Contreras just because I actually try for it sometimes. And I think if it's not him, it's going to be pretty scattershot who it ends up being.
All right. It's Willson Contreras for me as well. And then catcher 2, look, we're in agreement across the board. I really like Sean Murphy or Ivan Herrera if I can get
those are probably my 2. If not, I think Joey Bart as a late round. There's some playing time competition there with Andy Rodriguez coming back, but I thought Joey Bart was really good last year.
He definitely was. It's just how real is what we saw from Joey Bart. They still have Henry Davis on the 40-man roster. They still have Andy Rodriguez. So it sounds like it's Joey Bart's job to start, but obviously we'll see what he does with that. Scott, most likely to draft catcher 2. I feel like we all have the same names, but.
Well, I'm going to go so cheap that it'll probably be Alejandro Kirk. I'll probably be priced out of Murphy and Herrera.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So, do we still have more catchers to talk about here?
Oh yeah.
Okay, let's keep going then.
Yeah. Back to catcher ADP, and just a heads up, obviously we're going to go a little bit longer on the position previews, probably closer to like 80, 90 minutes on these. So just keep that in mind. I'm sure you don't care about getting more content, but just so you know, back to catcher ADP to finish out the show. We left off Tyler Stephenson as the 12th catcher off the board. There's about a 40 pick drop after him. Austin Wells with an ADP of 221. Sean Murphy, an ADP of 226. Connor Wong is down at 238. We mentioned all 3 of these names here, but Scott, anything else you would like to add on an Austin Wells, Sean Murphy, or Connor Wong?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. Austin Wells, did you give the expected stats on him? Because they're pretty impressive for a catcher especially.
I did not give them,
no. He has a 76th percentile expected WOBA. So he hit 229 with a 395 slug. The expected stats were 242, 429. He walks a lot. He is a left-handed hitter who knows how to take advantage of that short porch in right field at Yankee Stadium. They pretty consistently sat him against lefties, but you made the point there's not an alternative there. So I do think the playing time goes up, and I've warmed up on him a lot over the past couple months.
He didn't catch Garrett Cole last year, right? Wasn't that a thing?
I feel like that was a couple of years ago when they still had Higashioka on the roster, because I know that Higashioka was like a personal catcher for Garrett Cole.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it was actually a thing last year.
Okay. So I do remember there being some discussion about that. And that's one that, like, well, if he's not going to play against any lefties or most lefties and he doesn't catch Garrett Cole, then I could see it being like, oh, there might be like 105 game ceiling just because of the way that works out. But if not, then I don't think that's a worry.
Yeah. We spoke about Sean Murphy. I think we're all pretty optimistic on a bounce back with him. Only thing I'll add on Connor Wong is that he does contribute steals from a catcher position, and it's not a notable contribution, but 8 steals at catcher, it helps, every little bit. So just kind of a unique skill set that Connor Wong could offer if you do play in a roto league. If you play head-to-head categories, stay far away from Connor Wong. He improved the plate discipline last year, but the strikeout rate has been pretty bad in his career. 6 names going between ADP 260 and 300. Gabriel Moreno, Keibert Ruiz, Ryan Jeffers, Jonah Heim, Joey Bart, and Ivan Herrera. So some important names here we have not talked about at all yet. Gabriel Moreno, another one that feels like maybe his season a little bit derailed by injury. He went on the IL twice, once with a sprained left thumb, once with a strained left adductor. The power we saw from Moreno in the 2023 playoffs did not carry over at all. He has played 233 career games in the regular season. Moreno has a 393 slug and a 113 ISO. He did improve the plate discipline tremendously last year, but Chris, at some point, I think you kind of are who you are. I expect a good batting average, but less than 10 homers and probably a handful of steals from Moreno.
He actually hits the ball like reasonably hard, 90 mile per hour average exit velocity, but it's just, he almost never hits the ball hard and in the air, which has been Alejandro Kirk's issue. And they're very similar players in that way. He's fine. Getting a catcher who doesn't kill you in batting average is pretty cool. It's just, I don't think like he'll actually probably help you in batting average, to be clear. It's just
he's projected to hit 270 or better across the board.
Yeah, I just think he's a non-factor in the other 4 categories, more or less.
When I asked, do we have other catchers to talk about? I asked that because I wanted to talk about Gabriel Moreno, because I think just in terms of where I rank him at the position, I might be one of the highest on him. I have him 13th at the position. I have him ahead of Austin Wells and Sean Murphy. And part of that is because, so he hit 266 last year. A lot of that was those first 2 months when nobody in the league was hitting. And then he started to turn things around in June and suffered a sprained thumb and missed about a month there during the point in the year when everybody was picking things, when offense around the league was picking up again. When he did return, there was another IL stint in there that cost him a month. But for the 36 games he played, Gabriel Moreno slashed 325, 418, 439. Only 2 home runs in those 36 games. We talked about how that's an issue for him, but 18 walks versus 19 strikeouts. He almost never strikes out. I think in points leagues especially, Gabriel Moreno, if he avoids the injuries, that profile is built for that format. And he might be good as like a batting average specialist in Roto too. I think there's a lot to like here, and I think injuries and just the timing of them last year concealed how productive and valuable he could be.
Can I just give you my one Gabriel Moreno problem?
Sure.
Yep.
I'd rather see his backup play. I know that's not fair, and I'm doing the mystery box. I just want to see Adrian Del Castillo play. He was really good when he got to the majors last year. The underlying data didn't totally support it.
Right. Surface level stats. The exit velocities were bad. The strikeout rate was horrible. He's a bad defender. Like, he probably doesn't deserve to be catching at all.
No, I get it.
He was great in the minors and had good exit velocities there. So he probably is deserves a look in as a DH or something. But I don't think I understand you wanted to play over Moreno. I don't think he's actually going to take at bats away from Moreno.
And it's probably not justified.
Yeah. Especially when Moreno's 24 years old, and he actually is good defensively. He's 74th percentile framing, 90th percentile pop time.
And was an all-world prospect in his own right.
Yeah. So Moreno's going to get every opportunity to play. That's something that will help him. The playing time will actually help him in counting stats too. He's a totally serviceable high-end catcher too. I just don't want him as my catcher one, even if I decide to wait at the position.
In a points league, I might draft him as my catcher one.
You could probably
if I was going waiting till the last round to take my catcher,
I totally see that. Keibert Ruiz, everything dropped across the board for Ruiz last season. He rarely strikes out. It's an impressive skill. He has a minuscule strikeout rate, but Chris, his quality of contact is among the worst in the league. He's still just 26 years old, Keibert Ruiz. He's a volume play in a 2-catcher league, but I just don't think there's a very high ceiling here.
The defensive metrics are horrible as well. Yeah, I rank Keibert Ruiz as a starting caliber catcher, but I'm not sure I actually view him as one.
What a weird stat.
Yeah, he's got one weird trick. He never swings and misses, and that's it. And I just
they're pretty locked in with him though, right? Because they signed him to a long-term deal. They have Riley Adams, who's a pretty good backup.
He's gonna play,
but Ruiz, I guess he got to 13 homers last year, but even the batting average isn't that good.
He's another one, Keibert Ruiz, because of that microscopic strikeout rate, and because he's going to play a lot. Probably fine in points leagues. He had such a down year with batting average last year that he was less than fine in points leagues. But if he gets that back up 250, 260 range, he's probably a pretty good starter in points leagues.
I think he's a good target, Keibert Ruiz, in a deeper 2-catcher league where you just need guys who play, because I feel probably the most confident he's not going to strike out and he's going to play. Keibert Ruiz is going to be a compiler for the Nationals this season.
I just don't like this range of the rankings at all, with the exception of the one guy we've mentioned 8 million times that I do like.
Yep. Let's quickly talk about Ryan Jeffers, and a bit of a tough one to figure out. He got off to that awesome start and vastly improved his strikeout rate overall. And then on the other hand, he was flat out bad for the final 4 months of the season. Quality of contact took a huge step back from 2023. And Scott, I think there's a chance that the playing time could be at risk here for Jeffers because in the second half of the season, it felt like him and Christian Vasquez split time evenly. So
that was pretty true all season long. It looks like one start for Jeffers, one for Vasquez, one start for Jeffers, one start for Vasquez. I think early in the season he was getting some starts at DH.
Yeah, he was playing a lot of DH early
up, but then he slipped, as I mentioned, final 86 games, 616 OPS, I believe the stat was. So yeah, it's like from a fantasy perspective, Jeffers clearly much more interesting than Christian Vasquez. And honestly, from a real life perspective, I don't know what Vasquez brought to the table last year. He was terrible, but Rocco Baldelli has shown that he wants to give Vasquez a lot of playing time. And I don't think Jeffers did enough down the stretch to change that plan. So I could see it going either way. I kind of mentioned Jeffers as a bust possibility, but he cut his strikeouts way down last year. He clearly has a swing that's tailored to hit home runs. If he suddenly picks up a lot of playing time because Baldelli just says, I'm done with Christian Vasquez, he's not doing anything for us, then maybe Jeffers turns out to be a breakout candidate. But I have no faith in his role going into the year.
Jonah Heim was productive in both 2022 and 2023, took a huge step back last year, actually prompting the team to sign Kyle Higashioka in free agency. My guess is that they will split time almost evenly, which takes value away from both. Even in a two-catcher league, I don't really have interest in Jonah Heim or Higashioka.
Yeah, I mean, even in 2023, Heim, like 755 OPS is fine, but he was pretty average and then had 95 RBI, which made him a pretty easy fade because there was nothing actually all that special about the season he had. He just had a fluky high number of RBI. So if you end up with him as your number two catcher, I think everyone in this range pretty much is, with the exception of Moreno and Herrera, hopefully, I think are like, okay, if they're your number two catcher, you should be looking to upgrade if you can.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Joey Bart. It was a nice renaissance season for the former top prospect, strong barrel rate, but he did rate out pretty poorly as a defender. The Pirates catcher situation, we kind of mentioned it, a little bit confusing here. It sounds like Bart will be the starter to begin the season, but they also have former top prospects, Endy Rodriguez. They have Henry Davis still on the roster. Scott, any interest here in Joey Bart?
Yeah, Chris mentioned it before, is a fine second catcher to provide power. I don't even know that I'd classify last year as a renaissance year for him because he never really found his footing with the Giants, but this is a former elite catcher prospect, good power, obviously had 799 OPS as with the Pirates last year. And Ben Cherington said he enters the year as the favorite to start. So even with that young talent, I mean, Davis and Endy Rodriguez. Yeah, Endy Rodriguez. They're kind of at a point where Bart was. I know Rodriguez had health issues there that stalled his development, but they're kind of where Bart was with the Giants, where it's like, I don't know that you're going to develop into anything at this point. And Bart is producing, so I think he's going to continue to get the lion's share in Pittsburgh for as long as that lasts.
Just outside of the top 300 in ADP, we have Alejandro Kirk and Bo Naylor. We spoke extensively about Kirk already. Bo Naylor is someone who was a popular sleeper breakout from last year. He might just be really bad offensively, but actually graded out pretty well defensively. He flashed some upside in 2023. He's still young enough where he could potentially tap back into, something. It's an interesting skill set, a little power and speed, but Chris, the batting average has just been abysmal so far from Bo Naylor.
Yeah, he was unplayably bad for much of last season, and the athleticism was the one thing that I thought was going to be a thing that made Bo Naylor special, but was 28th percentile in sprint speed last year. I wonder if he was playing through something, and maybe that's why, but he just didn't seem to do anything well as a hitter last year.
The athleticism collapsed and the plate discipline. That was supposed to be standout for Bo Naylor. He went from 13% walk rate and 23% K rate in 2023, 13 and 23 to 7.5 and 31.4 last year. It's bad.
Yeah. So I think there's a chance. I mean, he's only 24. Catchers don't develop no prospects develop linearly, but catchers especially. So
Joey Bart, case in point.
Yeah. If Bo Naylor shows some signs of life early on, it'll be interesting to follow. But I think even going into the season as your number 2 catcher, I don't think that. I think there are enough number 1 catchers this year and not nearly enough number 2 catchers. That's the way I feel about the position.
Look, 13 home runs, 6 steals for Naylor last year. If he can get the batting average back up to where it was in 2023, 237 with 13 and 6. I mean, that would be an okay second catcher. It's just, do you actually bet on that happening? And the answer for me, I think all of us is probably no for Bo Naylor. Some names in deeper 2 catcher leagues. We have Dalton Rushing, who is the top catcher prospect and one of the top prospects in the Dodgers organization. We have Travis d'Arnaud, who's now on the Angels. Patrick Bailey, who is a great defender, does some interesting things. He hits a lot of line drives. The StatCast numbers are okay for Patrick Bailey, but we just haven't really seen it, translate into production yet for fantasy. And then Hunter Goodman, who had all this power in the minors. He's on the Rockies roster. Is he going to play enough? He's probably going to bounce around a little bit, get some playing time here and there. Scott, can you see in any deeper 2 catcher leagues going this deep into the player pool? Dalton Rushing, Travis d'Arnaud, Patrick Bailey, Hunter Goodman.
I can see it. Yeah. Cause I often wait till the last round to take my second catcher, and there are some lottery tickets here. Goodman, if he can find the playing time, should at least help in power, as you mentioned.
His minor league numbers are bonkers.
Yeah,
Hunter Goodman.
He's kind of, if you remember Evan Gattis, I think Hunter Goodman could, in a best case scenario, be that sort of impactful for fantasy. But there's no path for him at the moment. There probably will be at some point, let's be honest. Rockies lineup is not filled with all these stalwarts, I think there may be even some more interesting ones beyond here. Like if we're going to look at Rushing as a fantasy asset, I think I mentioned Drake Baldwin of the Braves. His numbers in the second half at AAA Gwinnett in terms of exit velocities and plate discipline were pretty spectacular. And Agustin Ramirez, who we already mentioned, I think there's a good chance he's starting somewhere for the Marlins, be it catcher or first base by May. And I think there's just a clearer path for those 2 to play than maybe there is for Rushing, barring a trade or a Will Smith injury.
Yeah, I mean, let's keep it going. Kyle Teal and Edgar Quero. I mean, I know there was some why would the White Sox trade for Kyle Teal when they already have a good catcher prospect? It's like that. Let that work itself out. Catchers bust at alarmingly high rates. I think they both deserve a look, and I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with Kyle Teal and Edgar Quero. And I mean, both are pretty proven at AAA, so they should be up at some point this season. So I think both of those are names to mention.
Did want to bring up a couple names outside 350 ADP we didn't mention, but Luis Campusano likely to split time. They signed Elias Diaz last week. The Padres did. So it feels like they're just going to take away from each other. I don't know that either one will be have any fantasy value. Mitch Garver still has catcher eligibility. I'm not exactly sure if he's going to play for the Mariners, maybe get some DH at bats or as the backup catcher. Danny Jansen signed a 1-year deal with the Tampa Bay Rays, and he's probably going to be their everyday catcher. He imploded last year, but before last year actually did some interesting things. Hits a lot of fly balls and decent barrel rate for Danny Jansen there. Chris and Jake Rogers, who's just really low batting average, a little bit of pop. But anything here on Campusano, Garver, Jansen, and Jake Rogers?
Jansen has the best chance just because he's the most likely of this group to catch 110 games. And we've seen some really good numbers from Danny Jansen at times. It's just kind of fell apart over the last year plus. So I'm not expecting much, but if he ends up as like the 17th best catcher this season, I really wouldn't be very surprised about that. So I think Danny Jansen stands out there. There are probably some other names, but yeah.
Miguel Amaya.
Miguel Amaya's one. And
Amaya becomes
Moya Ballesteros for the Cubs. He's a catcher, but Amaya had a good second half.
And he rates well defensively. They have Carson Kelly there too, who's not a bad backup, but I think they want Amaya to seize that job.
Mm-hmm. The last name I was going to mention was Moises Ballesteros, who you just brought up, Chris, who he's a little guy, but he packs a punch. Great batting average in the minors. He's hit for some pop. He's just not really a great defensive catcher. So
it's kind of Alejandro Kirk 2.0, except Kirk has now rated out as a great defender. Ballesteros, it's not clear he's going to stay there.
Yeah. So that's probably the biggest question. It's not like Amaya has been amazing for the Cubs. So if Ballesteros got up to a great start, maybe they would call him up. It's just
Ballesteros has a bigger prospect. He has defensive questions, and he's young. And Amaya's minor league track record is very good. Good on base skills. It looks like he was hurt a lot, but the numbers are good. The percentages are good.
It would also probably be a mistake to mention a bunch of prospects at catcher and not mention the best one, Samuel Basayo, who is the problem is he's an Orioles prospect who is obviously blocked by Adley Rutschman. And, Basayo is one of those guys where he's played a little first base. I don't know. I don't think he's played any other positions. Maybe they could try him in a corner spot, but I think that's more of a 2026 thing just because he doesn't turn 21 until August, but he's a big time prospect who could be, he's one of those catcher prospects that they talk about. He could play first base and be fine there, like offensively.
Yeah. That's how good the bat is expected to be for Samuel Basayo, who, does have some games at first base and DH throughout his minor league career, along with playing catcher. So if he gets to AAA and tears things up again, it's the same problem we have for all the other Orioles prospects, but the cream hopefully rises to the top this year in Baltimore. I think that's about everyone. Did I miss anything? Anyone else? Oh, I did want to just bring up David Fry because he was good for fantasy last year. People might be surprised. How did you not mention David Fry? He had elbow surgery and is going to miss about half the season. So just keep that in mind. Maybe someone we're picking up in the second half of the year for the Cleveland Guardians. We are going to wrap there for Scott and Chris. I am Frank. Thanks as always for tuning in to Fantasy Baseball today. Please make sure to follow and leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. And we will be back again tomorrow. Bye-bye.